Go for it.
Sorry, just can't see the presentation there. Hello, everyone. Um, my name is Matthew. This is Madassar. We're here to chat with you a little bit about tax incentives and funding in the Canadian gaming market. Um, Please feel free to save some questions for the end or throw them up in the chat and we'll definitely address those. Hopefully we're going to cover a lot of information that some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not be familiar with, some of you might be looking in from outside of Canada and just taking a look at what's really going on as far as this whole funding world that we have here within Canada. But we're happy to chat with everyone.
All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so I guess a bit over yourself. Matthew, do you want to start?
Yeah, a little bit about me. So my background in the industry has been about 15 years on the tax and financing side of the gaming industry. I started out in the tax credit side of the industry. A couple of tax credits really relative to the gaming industry, as well as some of these funding grant systems. It was about 6 years ago that we decided to get into a full-fledged, all things tax related to gaming. And also, over the past couple of years, I've been spending a lot of my time on the advocacy side of the industry, trying to increase and better these the tax credits specifically on a provincial basis, and how they interoperate with one another, and how that they can be better utilized within this growing industry that we have. And Madassar.
Right. So I've been working as an accountant for the last 10 years in the tech and gaming industries. So over the last few years, before we started Insert Coin, we were specialized in tax credits, but now we're kind of offering everything across the board in the gaming industry. So tax credits, audits, accounting, pretty much anything to do with gaming and or finance. Cool. So in terms of our overview, we'll start off with funding options just to get things started because as a gaming company, I guess the most pertinent question you have is how to raise money, right? And thankfully in Canada, we have more than one option when it comes to raising capital, uh, other than private funding, of course. So if you're lucky enough to have tons of cash saved up to invest in your business, that's great. But for the rest of us, there are more, I guess, practical options. So the first or the most popular one, the biggest program I think we have in Canada is the CMF, the Canada Media Fund. Now, the CMF in general funds, the majority of their funding goes towards film and TV projects, but then they have this stream called the experimental stream, which tends to focus on, I guess, interactive media, interactive digital media, as they call it, which is essentially video games. The program is administered by, it's a federal program and it's administered by an agency called Telefilm Canada. Again, you can tell probably from the name that its original intent was to work with general traditional media companies, but right now it's grown to kind of work across the board with interactive digital media companies as well. So the way the funding works is they fund up to 75% of the project. So it is a project-based funding. So they're not going to fund your company completely. It's based on the specific project. So when you're pitching your game, when you're pitching to the CMF, it's typically for a specific project in mind. And the way they fund is if they go ahead with it, they fund just the project itself. And they can go up to 75%. I think the maximum funding amount that CMF can fund for across the lifetime of a project is about $1.5 million. And they can either have that as a repayable advance. So depending on the stage of the project, so if it's in the earlier stages, it could just be an advance just to get your project off the ground. And eventually, once your project enters a full production stage, they actually they become an investor in the project. So they become, they fund up to 75%, and in return, they take a percentage of your profits for a specific period, up to 7 years, usually. So there's three stages that CMF provides funding in. There's conceptualization, which is the really early stage of the project. At that point, it's just an idea more so. Yeah, like it doesn't even have to be a playable product at that stage. It's just more so laying the groundwork for the game before it's even before you even start building out anything. The prototyping stage, like the names, like these are pretty straightforward names. So it's kind of like the first builds of the project, trying to get something working like an MVP almost of the game. And then the production is once that prototype has been out released, you can enter the actual building of the game. So this is where you have all your final art assets, your gameplay, your levels, everything figured out. And that's the part. The production is a part where the CMF comes in as an investor into the product, into the project. The other provincial funding options are in Ontario and BC specifically, although each province has similar funds that they have that they invest into interactive digital media. So the Ontario one is called the IDMF, the Interactive Digital Media Fund, and in BC it's called the BC Interactive Fund. And again, these are provincial programs, so they're administered respectively by Ontario Creates or Creative BC. And the way their funding is structured is usually just a contribution, so they don't actually become an investor into the project. It's more so just a one-time contribution that's not repayable to them in any instance. And the threshold for funding is a bit lower, so about 50%. And again, in terms of the stages of the project, it's kind of similar in terms of you have your production and concept definition. So you can see it kind of parallels the CMF stages in a sense. And then the marketing is just an additional add-on that's specific to these provincial funding agencies, although CMF does have some marketing expenses included in their production as well. And then we have the global market, which is kind of like an export fund. Um, that's kind of in line with the Creative Export Canada, which is also, again, a federal uh, fund that's targeted towards exporting your game or exporting specifically a creative project outside of Canada, which is also, it started out a couple of years ago and it's become quite popular now. And then one thing that's often overlooked is the IRAP in gaming.
Yeah, and just before I touch on IRAP too, just doubling back to the interactive funds there. BC is a relatively new program as well, so we can discuss kind of the differences between the program and some questions after the fact as well. BC is actually interesting in the sense that it doesn't require any matching funding whatsoever. It's relatively low. It's typically about $50,000 per funding requirement. IRAP is a great program. It's been around literally since the 50s. It was launched with the Avro Arrow. In the past, probably 15 years, it's become more accessible to even just software industries, and even more recently it's become more accessible to gaming companies. I find it quite underutilized when it comes to gaming. Now this fund, this grant has nothing to do with gaming. It has to do with true innovation, true R&D, and a lot of that is happening in gaming these days. What I like most about the program is that it is not a ton of paperwork like these other programs. It is essentially a relationship based program, so you're assigned one person your account. That person sticks with your account for the life of what you're doing, and they can actually grant up to $100,000, which may not be much, but up to $100,000, non-co-funded, again, non-repayable, so it's not diluting in any way, shape, or form. They have a number of different types of funding. They'll even fund individual people under what they call the youth employment program, so people that are in their first real career within the industry, and they're a little bit more lenient on the innovation requirements for that. And if you're getting bigger as well, IRAP can be used over and over again. So IRAP actually still has the old traditional models, and typically you can extend into those old traditional co-funded models. And it's not uncommon to see companies get many millions over the course of 5, 10 years through that program. Something that I definitely encourage people to look at if you're doing something a little bit heady in this space. If you're extending a platform, if you're extending an engine, like I said, a lot of the stuff is being done in this industry now. So a lot of strategy that goes into how to pitch them, how to discuss with IRAP and get them really sold on buying into your company as a whole. So the tax credits, there's a couple of tax credits. The primary tax credit that everybody's aware of, and something that's pretty public, not even just in Canada, but across the world, is this idea of digital media tax credits. So they're not necessarily just gaming tax credits; they're multimedia, but primarily they come down to gaming. They are provincial based, okay? And they're structured a little bit different on a province by province basis. They can be up to 40% in Ontario, which is the most lucrative program. However, in Ontario, you're looking at largely a project-based filing, which means you're waiting until you've completed your game before you're even filing, and then waiting a little bit of time to get those funds back and reinvest in the company or in the game itself. So in some cases, some of the other programs in other provinces are better, even though they're a lower percentage, because you're getting them back on an annual basis, and in some cases like PEI, you're actually getting them back on a quarterly basis. So even though there might be smaller percentages, effectively it helps you manage cash flow a lot better as well. The scrutiny behind each province is a little bit different as well. They each have various caveats of what qualifies as far as not just the game itself, but really more so the labor construct, how much that labor is within the province and how much of it is without the province. My opinion personally is, as it stands right now, is the Quebec program is the best program as structured. It's a little bit less percentage based than the Ontario program. Having said that, you're getting it back very quickly on an annual basis. Again, a lot of differences between the programs, so definitely happy to field questions rather than get into each one of them in detail right now. I'd really like to kind of gauge the audience and discuss those in detail once we conclude the presentation. So here's another program that I find often underutilized in gaming. It's called SHRED is the acronym that we all know it by. Again, a lot of people tend to think that it's something that isn't to do with gaming. It's true. It's not directly to do with gaming. It's to do with technology. It's not to do with necessarily innovation, which is another big misnomer about the program. It has to do with you looking to extend your knowledge in developing technology. So essentially, when you're writing code and you don't have some obvious solution to the problem you're facing, that's a very layman's way of looking at shred, which is in fact a lot of coding. Um, so it all comes down to discussing what you're doing and how you're trying to overcome these technological objectives, technological obstacles, and it's a federally based program. So it's an application that goes into the CRA itself, both from a technology and a financial perspective, where essentially you're showing that you're meeting the requirements of trying to overcome technological obstacles, process you took, and if you were or were not able to, either way, whether you failed or you succeeded, you do still meet the eligibility criteria on that side. The nice thing about it is that it is annual based, so it's based on your company fiscal year, and it has a relationship because it's a federal program. Each province has its own matching shred allocation. However, in most provinces, you're able to just refuse that provincial matching allocation and instead claim the multimedia tax credit. So in some cases, you can completely stack the provincial tax credit with the federal shred tax credit, like in Quebec, where you're getting up to 92 cents on the dollar back. Sorry, I should have doubled back and mentioned that the way Shred works is in its optimal state where you're just looking at Shred alone, your federal and provincial combined can be up to 62%. However, if you're doing what I just mentioned and breaking out the provincial portion so that you want to claim the provincial multimedia credit, then you're looking at a 54% rate still for the federal side, along with whatever your provincial rate is on the multimedia tax credit. And I mentioned Quebec is the better situation there because you can officially stack the two, whereas other provinces you have a grind effect where you have to reduce one tax credit by the other tax credit, but nevertheless you're still getting more than the 63% if it was just eligible for shred. And doing it this way, essentially you're claiming all of your high level technologically not innovative but technologically thought-provoking work, so a lot of your developers on the shred side, and then your art team and everyone else is the encompass under the larger category allowance for the multimedia credit. Okay. Now, financing is an interesting case here because it's something that it's a big part of what we're doing in the advocacy side these days is trying to get developers access to capital quicker. And that's not even just access to initial funding. That's just access to cash flow because in many cases we've got these tax credits, these things that are available to us. However, we're waiting on them for substantial periods of time. Um, it's always been a bit of an issue. There are two banks that will actually lend against tax credits in Canada. One is National Bank, the other is Royal Bank. However, you do have to have a banking relationship with them, and you have to have been in operation for a little bit of time for them to decide whether or not they want to do that. So it can be a little bit of an owner's process. However, it is there. Um, In the past couple of years, though, a few things have changed on that. You've got some private equity lenders that are actually looking to, they've gotten into the market that are a lot better than the prior predatory lenders that were charging like credit card interest rates to lend against these, because they're looking at it as possible future equity plays in the gaming world. So they're able to test out the market by taking a look at companies through financing their tax credits on a not a bank rate, but a relatively decent interest rate. And again, I'm going to go back to Quebec. The most optimal situation here is in Quebec. Quebec government actually will lend against tax credits at a typically less than bank interest rate for both the multimedia tax credits, which they oversee, but also the shred tax credit, which they have nothing to do with. So it's an interesting scenario there where they've really clearly adopted to the idea of getting money back in the hands of developers to reinvest in not even just the company, but reinvest in the project as quickly as possible.
So in terms of the application, so going back to the funding, there's a couple of things we found over the years in looking at various applications to these agencies or these organizations for funding. There are a few things that are, I guess you could say, things to watch out for when you're applying. Now, in terms of the application, each program has its own criteria on how they weight or how they grade your application. Obviously, there's a whole creative and innovative part that's kind of required. But on the financial side, there are a few things to look out for that'll help both your application and you as a company in terms of managing your cash flow when you're depending on an external source of funding. It's important to make sure you've got everything covered in a sense. And the first thing that often crops up in people's mind is how do I, in terms of getting funding from CMF or IDMF, there's a matching component. So they'll fund either 50 or 75% of the project, and it's up to you to come up with the rest of the funds. So one of the more common strategies we've seen is what's called a salary deferral, where essentially you as an owner of the company can forego a portion of your salary or your salary entirely if that's possible, and that counts as your contribution towards the project. So if you're, let's say, a game technical director for a game and you forego 6 months of your salary, that's maybe, let's say, $50,000 that you're contributing to the project by not paying yourself. So that's a pretty common thing that's accepted by all of the funding agencies as a way to match funds. Of course, there are some requirements where you might have to put in a cash contribution. Usually it's a 10%. So salary deferral wouldn't cover that. That's still a cash investment that you need to come up with for the project. In some cases and some agencies, tax credits can be considered a form of investing. So even though the timing is kind of reversed there, so you're getting the funding up front, but then you don't get tax credits until, in some cases, until the project is done. However, these agencies do realize that that's still an option and that you are entitled to those tax credits upon completion of the project. So you're able to essentially have that as a funding source for your project, even though it might not be until maybe even after project completion that you get that money in. And again, financing, interim financing, like Matt said, if there are some agencies that are some firms that are more cooperative in the sense of they're even willing to advance some funds against the tax credits, that could be an option in terms of your overall financial structure. Now, in terms of the budgeting, I can go over these pretty quickly. It's just essentially making sure you're not missing key elements of your project costs, so the audit review fee. So in some cases, and again, that's different by each agency, if your project exceeds a certain threshold, you're required to submit an independent audit report or a review engagement report. And there's a fee associated with that, again, which needs to be factored in because some if you're new, if this is your first time starting a company or building a game, you might not be aware of that, and that's something that isn't factored into your cash flow. Employer payroll costs would be anything that's on top of the gross salary. So as an employer, when you hire people on payroll, you have to pay a certain cost associated with that, and that's usually not factored in. It's usually around 10%, but it differs by province. The overhead costs, again, anytime you're building anything, there's going to be overhead beyond just labor costs, and those again, 10% is usually a good rule of thumb, and that's kind of the cap on most of these budgets. Is 10% of labor can be considered overhead, usually without any issues. And then they do allow for contingency upfront. So if you anticipate your project running longer or costs getting ending up higher than planned, that contingency is kind of there as a buffer to cover that. So if it's available, I would say use that to make sure you're not under the budget, because that's the only time you're in trouble really, is when your actual costs come in under the budget. In terms of equipment costs, again, you can't usually claim the entire cost. It usually has to be amortized and claimed only for that period. And the other big challenge is managing the cash flow. So usually, because these funding programs give out money in tranches, so usually you'll have a final payment, usually up to 20% of the project, that you don't receive until essentially until the game's completed. So you have to make sure that you have enough funds to see the game through to release, essentially until you get that final payment. Um, and the key consideration here is the audit requirement. So if there is an audit that is required upon project completion, it can take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to 8 weeks even or more, eh, to get that audit completed. And make sure you're budgeting for that and making sure you have some runway left in terms of your cash to make sure your operations are still running until that audit is completed. Because until that audit is done or that review is done, you don't get that final payment in, or you can't apply for the final payment essentially. And again, financing is always an option depending on the province. You could have some more favorable options like government financing. Otherwise, there are private lenders is always an option depending on which bank you go with. Now, in terms of financing, obviously this has been pretty unique year. So there have been a lot of, I guess, funding options available for Canadian companies. Um, CMF has played a big part in kind of distributing these funds to gaming companies. They've had several rounds of funding now available to companies, either both pre-revenue companies and game studios that have actually released something commercially in the last couple of years. And as of right now, they've completed all of their funding rounds. There might be some more announced in the future. We're just not sure at this point. But as of right now, all of that has been wrapped up. The wage subsidies, again, these are federal government subsidies, and they first started in March, sorry, and they've been going on until now. And just now it was announced, originally it was scheduled to end in December, but they've been extended to June of next year. So the government, CRA, has released more details on how this program is going to look like over the next few months. So if you are, if that was a concern at some point, then it's good news definitely to know that you have an additional 6 months where you could get part of your wages subsidized. The other option is SIBA, which is more of an upfront or lump sum funding option. And essentially, it's a $40,000 loan from the government, part of which can be forgiven if you meet certain repayment terms. And it was announced last month that that 40,000 has now been increased to 60,000. Now, out of that 60,000, I think 20,000 is the amount that can be forgiven as long as you repay some of it by the end of 2021, I believe, is the most recent date. And finally, the government has also decided to back a lot of loans through banks. So BDC and EDC are two funding agencies. I think they're owned by the federal government as well. And essentially, they're backing loans through your bank, and they have amounts as small as 100,000 or even less than that. It could go for a working capital loan, which is basically there's no minimum. And I believe the maximum is about just over $6 million in funding. So depending on your needs, there are a lot of options available, and all of these are available through the bank. So it would be, depending on who you bank with, you have to reach out to your account manager or just apply online and see if you can qualify for any of that.
And these programs have really been evolving as well. Because I'll be honest, I feel like our industry, by and large, was left out of these programs early on because of some of the requirements of revenue. And a lot of gaming companies, as we all know, are pre-revenue for quite some time. Even they can have a substantial employee base while still being pre-revenue. So they have made some adjustments to that. CMF adjustments were one of the large adjustments made to that. And they're continuing to. So these are essentially the second round of rollouts of these programs. We're still entering future phases, and the stimulus phases will come in hopefully at least in 2021. So we continue to update this information as quickly as we can on our website. We're always happy to address any questions on that side. Another question that is definitely coming up now as we're entering the end of the year is the relationship to tax credits to government funds, as far as are these or are these not considered government assistance? And I regret to inform you that in many cases they are. Wage subsidies are considered government assistance. They were paid directly by the government, so you're not going to be claiming a tax credit on top of that. But also it starts to create this dilemma, which I anticipate that we're going to see very shortly in the industry, whereby there is this theoretical and essentially official threshold where you cannot have over 100% in funding for a project. Um, Now that we've got wage subsidies on top of other levels of funding, it stands to reason that we are definitely going to see many companies that are going to exceed 100% in funding. So we're waiting to find out from CMF and from other governing bodies how exactly they're going to handle that, because asking companies to repay portions of that is an immediate death sentence for a number of companies in the industry. So I do expect that they're going to make some adjustments on that, but as it stands right now, you can pretty much bank on wage subsidies being considered as government assistance.
Mhm. Great. So that's a good overview of, I think, the funding and tax credit side. So moving on to the company itself and how you would structure your own internal systems and accounting setup. I think there's a few things we can go over here. I think Matt, do you want to
Can we touch
walk
on
us
these?
through?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
So essentially, what we really want to go through here is our preferred accounting package for this industry, and it's because with all these funds related to this industry, with the grants, with the tax credits and whatnot, there are some reporting requirements. Um, and I mean, these packages that we use make it easier for any company really to do their accounting, but specific to this industry, the ability to track on a project by project basis, on an expense, certain expenses and costs of different projects is highly relevant to be able to pull reports when you're reporting back to IRAP, to CMF, to Ontario Creates. So two primary cloud accounting platforms. So essentially the bookkeeping base of what you're doing, Xero and QuickBooks. Everybody knows QuickBooks. But in this case, I find that QuickBooks Online really was reactionary to the industry, and they're still playing catch up. Granted, they have deep pockets to play that catch up, but our preference has always been Xero. They've been around still for quite some time, but they were the first provider, and they're built in building cloud applications for accounting. I believe they're based out of New Zealand, but they do have a rather large market stake. And frankly, it's just an easier, simpler interface to work with. And the one of the most dominating factors in there is something that should be fixable on both sides. And that's this idea of being able to communicate back and forth with your accountant through your bookkeeping platform. You can't do that on QuickBooks, whereas with Xero you can. Perhaps they'll be changed in the future, but it hasn't been changed as of yet. Otherwise, it's really just a UI preference for Xero.
Mhm.
So, Muddy, you want to touch on? I
Sure. Yeah.
missed a couple
So
of those things with that. So,
yeah, I can go over that right now. So the whole idea behind cloud accounting as a replacement for traditional accounting is the idea that it's all obviously on the cloud, so which means it's real time. So you and your accountant or bookkeeper are seeing the same information, and because it's connected to uh, everything you can think of, like your bank system, your bank feeds, your payroll system. The idea is that you're able to see the same information in real time and get a more accurate picture of your business. Again, because it's all online, you can collaborate. So your producer, the owner of the business, and your accountant, they're all able to see the same information and work basically remotely, which is obviously a big consideration now, as well as being able to access this information anywhere. And again, the whole idea behind it being on the cloud is it's connected to a whole bunch of different services. So the most important is because of the bank feeds functionality, it's pulling information directly from your bank, and which helps the process significantly instead of having to enter things manually. And the other idea behind these platforms is that instead of being a standalone system, you have the option to kind of connect because, again, they're all in the cloud, they have APIs. So, what you'll see is frequently they have other add on apps that are kind of uh, being developed by independent companies. And if there's any functionality or any features that's missing in the software, now on its own, they're pretty good systems. They're robust. You're able to do pretty much all of the accounting functions within it, but there are things that sometimes that maybe independent add-ons can do much better. So the most frequent use cases we've seen for these are usually expense claims. So we have apps like Expensify or Receipt Bank, which essentially, I guess, it's more relevant pre-COVID in a sense because of travel and so on. So anytime you're attending like games conferences or traveling or meeting with publishers or clients, you can have each individual employees spending their own money and then they're able to submit expense claims. So this is normally a big pain point for companies, but because of these apps, it's the whole process is made much easier. The other uh, solution that we have is Receipt Bank. Again, it also addresses the issue of paperwork, which again, the whole cloud idea behind cloud accounting is to not deal with, files and folders and I guess files full of paper. And having everything online is a huge help, even when your accountant is remote. So again, because of these automated systems, you're not having to manually mail in or fax in even statements and receipts and invoices, right? It's all done through the cloud systems. And to a point, it's pretty automated as well. So once everything's set up correctly, initially, there's not a lot of work for you to kind of follow up on these things. The other big one is payroll. Again, traditional payroll methods or even processing payroll manually is pretty time consuming. And because of a lot of cloud payroll apps, that whole process becomes a lot easier. And again, because it's all connected to your main accounting software, everything, all the data is always there and it's synced pretty easily. Finally, the time tracking part is relevant here because again, because of all of the tax credits that we talked about earlier, it becomes really important to kind of manage or sorry, track your employees' time, making sure it's being spent on the right types of activities and on the right projects. When you have multiple projects going on, it becomes really important to kind of separate that time out so you can track your costs per project and then also by type of activity for each project because some tax credits only let you claim certain types of activities, and that's where it becomes important to make sure you're not missing out on tax credits because of inaccurate time tracking. And
So
that's just a few of, sorry, that's just a few of the benefits on the cloud accounting software. Go ahead, man.
yeah, I was just going to say we tried to give you a general overview of pretty much all tax related items within the accounting world, or within the gaming world, I should say, in Canada. Definitely happy to address some specific questions. If you'd like to follow us, this is what we look like from behind. But in all seriousness, we really hope we've given you a good overview. We've always taken the approach of being for the betterment of the industry. Yes, of course, we do offer services, but at the same time, we're happy to talk to people, especially newcomers into the country, or just people setting up their studios to make sure that they are set up with the right footing so that they can strategize towards achieving some of these goals in the future. We don't hide behind some sort of fee structure. We just want to make sure that you understand it. And I've always been of the mind of giving up time for free just to make sure that people are out there and able to kind of achieve these goals. So feel free to reach out to us at any point in time. You can see some of the things that we do, and these are the ways that you can reach out to us. You can find our Discord invite just directly on our website as well. Okay, but thank you very much, Natalie, IGDA, and Hannah for setting this up, and maybe we can field some questions.
Thank you.
I think we are all good for questions. Looks like there will be a VOD on the IGDA YouTube channel, and the link was dropped in the stream chat. So whoever would like to subscribe there, the presentation will be available shortly on their YouTube channel.
Excellent.
Cool. Natalie, anything else we can do for you?
Nope, that's everything. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.